Good afternoon, everyone. So, in this lecture, I'm going to talk about another difficult chapter in our nation's story, which is about the eugenics movement, which was a global movement, but we're going to focus on how it manifested in the United States in the early 20th century. So, to understand eugenics, we have to go a little bit further back in time and talk about scientific racism of the 19th century. And there were several different scientists that led these studies, but the field where a lot of this developed was a field called phrenology, and it was a field defined by Franz Joseph Gall, and became really popular in the United States in the 1830s and 40s. Basically, there was this idea that within the brain there are these multiple kind of organs, and in each of those organs there are particular kinds of traits that are emphasized. So, understanding the organs of the brain can help us understand mental and physical traits of the person. And there was a particular interest in studying the size and the shape of skulls. So phrenologists took a lot of skulls of various different groups of people, people that they considered to be different kind of racial types, and they measured those skulls and drew conclusions about particularly about the mental capacity of that person based on the size and shape of their skull. And phrenology was popular in the United States at a time when, things like the abolitionist movement was spreading, and there was increasing kind of pressure to justify slavery as a legal institution. And so some phrenologists did studies, and what they concluded was that studying the skulls of African Americans and of whites, they concluded that African Americans could be tameable or more tameable, and that they sort of needed to have a master. And so it was this kind of study that really reinforced pro-slavery arguments. They also use this to justify the removal of indigenous peoples, because another phrenologist, Samuel Morton, found that according to his study of the skulls, that he found that Native Americans were slow to acquiring knowledge and kind of adverse to cultivation. So, and keep in mind, of course, this is really what we would call a pseudoscience. I mean, it's using scientific language and jargon, but it's drawing conclusions based on really faulty evidence. But a number of Americans, really white Americans, this is what they wanted to believe, and so it was a good example of a kind of a pseudoscience that reinforced existing prejudices. And I'll show you this illustration is one of the ones that you see most often when talking about these kinds of movements. And of course, one of the first things you note is how the illustration itself um, kind of reinforces this argument that people of African descent are very similar to apes, and so this was definitely a very kind of racist kind of argument that was asserted. And you can see the skull. I want to note that this illustration of the skull of the person of African descent is very inaccurate. It's the drawing itself is shaped in such a way that it does not correspond to any human skull. But I also want to call attention to the image at the top, which is supposed to be a kind of European American, and you could see from the skull, and it says Greek, but the image that they show is not any kind of, realistic image of a Greek person or of any other kind of person of Mediterranean or descent, but it's of the statue of Apollo, who we probably know is actually a Greek god. So it's interesting that in this illustration that was in a kind of scientific textbook, they're essentially comparing white people to gods, and that tells you something about the way that these studies not only denigrated groups that were classified as not white, but they elevated groups that were considered white. I also wanted to note about phrenology that there were associations with other kinds of traits as well, including kind of moral traits. And so this was used most often, very often, to talk about the ideas of race. But they were also used to kind of make judgments about people's moral capacity. And I thought this was an interesting example of a study of skulls where one could supposedly determine who would be a good or an unreliable husband. And phrenology was a widely popular movement into the 19th century, but it gets sort of gradually more challenged later on. But a lot of these same ideas we see kind of reemerge in the early 19th century with the field of eugenics. And these are the two basic things to remember about the field of eugenics. One is that it's this basic belief that differences in class and culture are the result of biology. They're not the result of environment. They are the result of what you inherently have, what your biological traits. And also that it's drawing on these older ideas, and it's also drawing, of course, on social Darwinism, which we've talked about a little bit before. But it's also very modern, and it's using some of the findings of the new science of genetics. So eugenicists in the early 19th century really considered themselves quite modern, and technological. The term was originally coined by Francis Galton, and we'll talk a lot about his ideas. It was really his ideas that kind of framed the movement. And he was really interested in how human traits would be inherited. Here's the genetic connection, right? So it's like the idea that you can kind of describe a person's character by studying their biological traits, but also this real interest in what of those traits can be inherited by their children. And the other part I want to highlight here is his definition emphasizes, as you can see here, the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. So this is an emphasis on policy. So this isn't just a kind of study, let's see the kind of differences among people. This is about, let's design policies that are going to cultivate the best traits and reduce the number of people who have the more negative traits. Charles Davenport was another American eugenicist that helped to kind of circulate these ideas that a lot of things are hereditary. And you can see this is a long list, and of course you can read this list and you can see certain things that we would say today are genetic, like eye color, hair color, etc. Even things like certain kinds of cancers or certain forms of disease. But see, in the middle there, you see these things that are also associated as hereditary: mental ability, shiftlessness, insanity, pauperism, criminality. So a number of these things that later people would, or even at the time, really some people would kind of challenge as being products of the environment, or of other social policies. Davenport and others says, no, this is something that's inherent. These are qualities that are inherent in the person and can be passed down to their children. And it's particularly interesting with regard to social class. So Davenport noted that social classes are ordained by nature, and this idea that not the slums which make slum people, but slum people who make the slums. So we see a very clear connection to social Darwinism and to the kind of laissez-faire approach to that government takes in the Gilded Age here. That's kind of continuing in this field of eugenics. I want to say particularly about criminality. So one of the things that Galton did was he created these composite portraits. So he took these portraits of people who were convicted of crimes, and you can see some of the portraits at the top here. This is an example. And he took those and put those photographs together, created these composites so that you could kind of identify, this is what criminals look like. And if you see somebody like this person is probably more likely to be a criminal. And he would later go on to do this for other populations as well. So he starts off with people who are imprisoned for various crimes. Then he turns to other populations, including people who are defined as mentally ill or have tuberculosis, and Jewish people. And this is how it is these kinds of studies later that really are very influential in the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. It's important to remember that actually the field of eugenics was most well established in the United States in the very early 20th century, and it was, I mean, the Nazis got their ideas from American eugenicists. So Galton also had a way of, you could get that image that I showed you at the front, talks about what's called these eugenics certificates. So some people wanted to, because there was this big emphasis on, I want to marry somebody who is eugenically fit, or I want to see what is my eugenic kind of fitness. And so Galton developed this questionnaire. And you could see that the image in the title slide was, this woman kind of rejecting a man's proposal because he didn't have a eugenics certificate. So these are some of Galton's questions that he would ask if he took this questionnaire. So some of it's, your name, etc. Notice the interest on genealogy, asking for the full name and surname of your parents, asking what their occupations are. There's questions about, have you had a physical exam? What were the results of that exam? And then there's this big emphasis on competition, on kind of on any kind of evidence that you are not just kind of capable physically and mentally, but that you've kind of excelled. So this question at the bottom, can you refer to any physical competition that you were ranked distinctly higher than the average of your competitors? And a similar question here, but this takes it even further. Have you performed any physical feats that were distinctly beyond the powers of men of the same age and of equal training to yourself? I'd be really curious to see if anybody answered yes to that question. But it sort of shows how they're looking for you to sort of give evidence of your extraordinary abilities, not just kind of ordinary abilities. Other things are about sort of mental fitness, so literary examinations, and awarding, have you been awarded prizes or other distinctions? Have you been awarded coveted positions, right? So how have you been recognized for these values? And certainly some of these things are things that we put on resumes today, right? Any awards we get, any kind of distinctions that we have, things that we've accomplished. But we usually recognize, of course, that these are the product of the certain kind of learning that we've been able to have, certain kind of resources we have. It's a kind of combination of, some abilities we have, but also opportunities to cultivate those abilities. But eugenicists really saw this as, oh, okay, if I find these people who are really extraordinary, that is evidence that this is something that's inherent in them, and thus, this is a person we really want to have children. So Galton would give these. These are the grades that he would give. Um, and and so you would be evaluated based on this. And if you were successful, you would get this eugenics certificate that supposedly you could give to show to your potential spouse. And so this was something that was practiced among some Americans at the time. One of the other kind of anxieties that is fueling this movement is this idea of race suicide. So we've talked a little bit about rising rates of immigration, particularly from kind of Southern and Eastern Europe, and some of the anxieties of white Americans who were more of a kind of Northern European descent about, what's going to be the impact of all of these new immigrants. And this idea that essentially poor people are having too many children and rich people are not having enough, and particularly rich, of course, rich white people. So the idea is that if we don't do something, all of these so-called kind of inferior groups are going to outnumber us, and we're going to get sort of overrun by these so-called inferior folks. And there were other things that were used to sort of demonstrate this. So in towns throughout the country, especially in areas of the Midwest, they would have what's called fitter families contests. So they would give you this kind of information. The image on the left is a baby who is considered the most eugenically fit baby in Minnesota, for that particular year. And so they would have these contests also to kind of encourage people to sort of highlight or to encourage certain populations to have more children. This is one of the exhibits that was on display within that building. And you can't see, of course, the flashing lights, but if you were there in person, you would be able to see these as flashing lights. And there's a sense of course, of this idea that these folks who are born that will be a burden to us, that they're being born too often, and folks who are more kind of eugenically fit, so to speak, are not being born often enough. So this was supposed to kind of demonstrate the crisis that was looming. So eugenics also did result in several policies at both the federal and state levels. So positive eugenics policies, positive in the sense that it was about kind of encouraging certain groups. So you could get tax preferences, you could get financial support if you were deemed eugenically fit and you were having a large family. Negative eugenics policies were more about reducing the populations of people who were considered less fit. So a lot of laws about racial segregation, restrictive immigration, anti-miscegenation laws was a particular area that was emphasized. And that means the laws against the marriage between white and non-white people, particularly between white and Black Americans, and sterilization policies. And I'm going to say more about that in a minute. But so the 1924 immigration law, which drastically reduced the number of people allowed to immigrate, but this particularly targeted Jewish populations from Eastern Europe, Slavic populations, and other populations in Southern Europe. And then you had the rise of sterilization laws. Indiana was the first in 1907. They used this to sterilize a number of people who were in their prisons. But this spread to many other states. So by 1931, you had 26 states that had these laws. And overall, during this period, at least 60,000 people were sterilized. Particularly, actually, the state that had the greatest number of sterilizations was actually California, because some of the most prominent eugenicists were at Stanford University. So many thousands of Americans lost their ability to have children because they were deemed. Often it was either because they had been arrested and so they were imprisoned, or because they were deemed quote unquote kind of feeble-minded. Some people were sterilized because their parents, they were orphaned because their parents had been alcoholics. And in the South, this mainly targeted African Americans. In other parts in California, for example, there were people who were kind of deemed mentally unfit, or people who were in orphanages or state institutions were targeted the most. You can see this map, the states, and there's kind of the color coding that you can see here. And if you have time to look back later, you can pause and look at this most closely. But you can just see the number of states that were considering it. This is only 1913. There are some other states that do this afterward. And another kind of legacy of eugenics is one of the most famous studies, the Tuskegee study. So where researchers of the Public Health Service, they exposed African American men to syphilis. And they didn't treat it because they wanted to see whether the effect of syphilis was different for African American men versus white men. And so this was one of the most horrific scientific studies that was kind of influenced later by the eugenics movement. Also horrific because it went on so long. It went on until 1972. And that is not the only study that was influenced by eugenics, but those are some of the main ones.